I was raised in a remote region of a southern state, far from towns or paved roads. My father built our rough cabin in an overgrown clearing that sat nearly 2 miles from the nearest dirt path. By the time I could speak in complete sentences, he had me wrestling in the mud and running sprints around our property at dawn. He demanded absolute dedication. He loathed what he called weakness and never allowed me to complain. Any protest ended with grueling drills or harsh reminders that softness would cost me my life. He insisted I master various combat techniques. He introduced me to boxing fundamentals at an age when most children learn simple playground games. He then moved on to wrestling, taekwondo, sambo, and freestyle grappling. Every evening he scrutinized my form. He corrected every misplaced foot, every angle of my shoulders. He repeated that confusion in real combat meant defeat. As I grew taller, he increased the intensity of my training. He would supervise my punches until my knuckles bled. He provided no comfort. He said injuries were an accepted part of my destiny. We lived in constant isolation. I never attended public school. My father believed that such places produced weak minds. He taught me to read and write using outdated manuals he kept in a lockbox. I was required to study them every evening by lantern light. He emphasized that knowledge was valuable only if it supported strength and survival. I had no friends except for the stray dogs that sometimes wandered onto our land. He forbade me from speaking to outsiders. If we encountered travelers on the winding trails, he kept silent and expected me to do likewise. Over time, he introduced me to firearms. He demonstrated how to disassemble rifles and pistols on a rickety wooden table beside our cabin. He showed me the importance of maintaining clean barrels, sturdy firing pins, and flawless trigger mechanisms. Later, he took me to a hidden clearing and taught me to shoot. He placed tin cans at various distances, from 30 feet to nearly 100 yards. I had to strike each target without flinching. He insisted that a single missed shot could mean death in a real engagement. Mistakes were unacceptable. He believed in blade combat as well. He trained me with hunting knives, machetes, and even short spears. My favorite was a standard-issue military knife with a firm handle that fit my grip perfectly. He made me practice thrusts and slashes against crude straw dummies tied to wooden posts. He supervised each motion with stern patience. He reminded me that up-close encounters tested not only agility but also the will to kill. He said hesitation in close quarters would lead to my demise. There was no room for mercy. There was only survival. Sometimes he dragged me deep into the woods and left me there with a single blade. He expected me to live on whatever I could hunt or gather. He never offered sympathy if I returned with cuts or bruises. Instead, he rebuked me for poor preparation or careless movement. If I shivered in the cold, he accused me of inadequate planning. If I went hungry, he said I lacked proper determination. I resented those nights alone under crude shelters of branches, but I had no choice. My life depended on executing his requirements. I never understood his motives. I assumed he was bitter or scarred by past conflicts. He rarely spoke about his life before my birth. He never mentioned my mother. He refused to answer questions about her. When I pressed him once, he warned me never to bring it up again. I sensed that there was a hidden truth, but I could not uncover it. He worked me to the bone every day. When I was too exhausted to stand, he continued to push me. He insisted that I must surpass all ordinary limits. Occasionally, I saw a flicker of something unnatural in his eyes. In those moments, I felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the wind. I did not question it because I assumed he was simply harsh by nature. Over time, I blamed myself for not pleasing him enough. I strove to be stronger, faster, and more efficient. I ignored the tightness in my chest whenever he seemed almost inhuman. By the time I reached 17, I had learned every survival skill he could teach. Yet I remained uncertain about his true intentions. Still, when I turned 17, my father announced another test. He said nothing about its length or its difficulty. He simply led me deeper into the forest, crossing rocky slopes and weaving through thick undergrowth for what felt like miles. We moved in silence, carrying no provisions. Once we reached a secluded area where tall oaks and dense shrubs blocked most of the sunlight, he stopped. He placed a hand on my shoulder and told me to remain there until he returned. Then he walked away with a steady stride, leaving me alone. At first I assumed he would be back in a day or two. Yet days turned into weeks. I hunted small animals with crude tools fashioned from sharpened stones and broken branches. My father had taken my usual weapons. I focused on his lessons. Move quietly, stay aware of wind direction, conserve energy during the hottest hours. I gathered water from a narrow creek and boiled it over a simple fire pit. I slept in shelters made of twigs and leaves. The nights were cold, and I sometimes woke to the sounds of distant howls that made me grip my makeshift knife tightly. I pushed aside any fears. I believed this was the ultimate demonstration of independence. I reminded myself that I had endured his training for years. I reasoned that if he wanted me to fail, he would not have invested so much time shaping my instincts. Yet as the days passed, I began to wonder if he intended to return at all. One afternoon, while searching for edible plants near a shallow ravine, I heard unfamiliar voices. I had gone years without speaking to anyone except my father, so I froze behind a tree and peeked out cautiously. Through the foliage, I noticed a group of people setting up tents near a clearing. Their vehicle was parked at the edge of a rough trail about 50 yards away. I saw a teenage girl among them. She was helping unfold a large canvas tent. Her hair glistened in the sunlight and she looked cheerful. I could hear her laughter drifting through the branches. I considered sneaking away, but curiosity held me in place. I watched them gather firewood. I saw them set out blankets and chairs. I observed their casual manner, which was unlike the constant vigilance my father had taught. They chatted in relaxed tones. They seemed at ease in this forest that I had always viewed as a battleground. That evening I ventured closer. My hair was tangled, my clothing was filthy, and my worn boots were caked in mud. I still carried a stone blade tucked into my belt. My face felt grimy, and I realized I probably looked like a wild figure. Yet I felt compelled to approach. I stayed just beyond their firelight, but the girl spotted me. She spoke to her parents, and they turned toward me with alarm in their eyes. I raised my hands, trying to show I meant no harm. They hesitated, whispering among themselves. The girl stepped forward and asked if I was lost. I mumbled a reply, my voice weak from disuse. I told them I had been alone for a month, which was true, although I offered no details about my father's involvement. I introduced myself with awkward difficulty. My tongue struggled to form simple phrases. She listened carefully, nodding, and urged her parents not to send me away. Her name was Mia. Her openness surprised me. My father had never warned me about friendly strangers. He had only spoken of threats and ambushes. Mia's parents still appeared uneasy, but she convinced them I was harmless. She extended an offer to sit by their fire. They brought me a plate of food. I was overwhelmed by the warmth of this family. They spoke about their camping trip, their usual home life, and their plans to stay in the area for a few days. I listened in silence, absorbing details about a world far different from my own. I tried to speak more, but I was unpracticed. I stumbled over certain words. Mia smiled each time and reassured me that she understood. She asked questions about my life, and I struggled to answer without revealing the harsher realities. I described hunting small game. I mentioned that I had learned how to create makeshift shelters. She seemed amazed that I survived so freely in this forest. She laughed often, and her laugh was vivid. Maya's family stayed in the forest for several days, and during that time, I lingered near their camp. I had no expectation of my father's return, and I found myself captivated by the ordinary moments they shared. They told funny stories, played simple outdoor games, and talked around the campfire late into the evening. Mia's father teased her about her enthusiasm for nature, and her mother tried new recipes over the open flame. I listened and marveled at their closeness. Mia spent hours asking me questions about my life. She wanted to know where I learned to hunt and whether I had gone to school. I tried to explain that my father had been my only teacher, though I did not describe his severity. She was intrigued and puzzled. She looked at me with genuine kindness. She talked about her own life outside these woods, mentioning her friends, her father's Canadian background, and the way she juggled school activities. I could not imagine any of it because my existence had always revolved around survival drills and strict regimens. At dusk on the third evening, the four of us relaxed around the campfire. I had almost forgotten my solitude. The warmth of companionship eased my tension. Mia's laughter felt like something bright that I had never known. I recall the wind shifting in the treetops just before we heard an abrupt noise in the undergrowth. I reached for the small hatchet Mia's father had placed beside the logs. My instincts tensed. Mia's mother asked if I thought it might be a wild animal. I nodded without hesitation. Suddenly, a shape lunged out of the darkness, moving with unnatural speed. It was much larger than any wolf I had encountered. Its posture was bent forward, its shoulders broad, and its jaws revealed elongated fangs. The creature's eyes gleamed in the firelight. It seemed to assess the camp rather than act purely on instinct. Mia's parents shouted in terror. I rose to my feet, gripping the hatchet with both hands. The creature charged, leaping at Mia's father. He stumbled backward and I rushed forward, swinging the hatchet with every ounce of force I possessed. The blade struck the beast's shoulder, but it did not fall. It let out a guttural snarl that sent chills through me. It knocked me aside with a single blow. I felt a ripping pain across my arm as claws tore my skin. I scrambled to maintain my grip on the hatchet. Mia's mother screamed. Mia pulled her parents away, but the monster advanced, its eyes locked on them. Blood seeped through my torn sleeve and my breath was ragged. I realized the creature was more intelligent than any wild predator. It circled around the campsite, cutting off possible escape routes. I waited for a chance to strike again. Mia's father tried to throw a small flashlight, hoping to startle it, but the beast barely flinched. It lunged for me once more, jaws snapping. I swung the hatchet into its flank. The impact was hard, but still it endured. I saw an opening and pressed my advantage. I drove the hatchet deeper, twisting it to enlarge the wound. The creature recoiled in anger, emitting a sound that rattled my eardrums. It was wounded, yet it forced itself to remain upright. I sensed a vicious intelligence behind its eyes, as though it refused to relinquish its hunt. Moments later, it turned and bolted into the darkness, vanishing among the tangled trees. I collapsed against a large rock, blood dripping down my arm. Mia and her parents rushed over. They could not believe what they had just witnessed. They helped me to their vehicle and gave me water. My vision blurred from pain. I heard their voices, but I struggled to concentrate. Mia pressed a clean cloth to my wounds. I could see tears in her eyes as she pleaded for me to stay awake. At dawn, they drove me to the nearest small hospital, which stood nearly 20 miles from that campsite. My injuries were severe, though I remained conscious enough to answer a few questions from the medical staff. Maya and her parents hovered in the waiting area for a short while, but I faded in and out of awareness. When I finally became lucid, they were gone. A nurse told me they left a brief note of thanks, but provided no address. I spent a week in that modest hospital, recovering from claw marks and deep lacerations. The doctors looked puzzled when I tried to describe the creature that attacked me. They assumed it was a large wolf or possibly a rabid dog. I nodded but felt uneasy. The medical staff offered no further questions and focused on treating my wounds. I had no insurance, no identification, and no way to pay. One nurse suggested I speak to local authorities, but I slipped away once I could walk. I took only a spare shirt and the bandages they had applied. I managed to follow the rural routes back to the place my father and I called home. It took 2 days, walking along dirt roads and cutting through fields when I feared passing vehicles. I felt alone in a way I had never experienced. My father was gone, and I had no idea where he might be. I arrived at our cabin late at night. Moonlight revealed a broken window, an overturned stool, and no footprints. The interior looked abandoned. I called out for him, half expecting his stern voice to answer. Silence filled every corner. He had taken none of our weapons or supplies. The few items that appeared missing were items I barely recognized. I found a half-empty jar of dried beans and an unused pack of matches on the shelf. Everything felt stale. I sank onto a wooden chair, ignoring the pain in my bandaged shoulder, and tried to think. I believed my father might return, but days passed without his arrival. While rummaging through a trunk, I discovered a small journal bound in worn leather. It bore a woman's name. At first, I did not realize it belonged to my mother. The entries described her work as a park ranger. She wrote about patrolling a national park, tracking predators, and monitoring the ecosystem. She mentioned searching for a particular wolf that seemed unusually cunning. The final pages referenced a rumor about a beast that walked on 2 legs at times and on 4 at others. Her words ended abruptly. No explanation followed. My breath caught in my throat. I realized these pages might hold a clue to the strange creature that attacked Mia's family. Yet the journal never identified the beast explicitly. It hinted at a cunning wolf that stood outside normal behavior. I wondered if my father knew about this journal all along. I recalled his silence whenever I asked about my mother. I wondered if he had hidden the truth from me. Inside the trunk, I found an old photograph. It showed a pregnant woman smiling, and next to her stood a tall, grim-faced man who resembled my father. The photo was taken at some park attraction, with a merry-go-round in the background. I felt my chest tighten. I realized I was looking at my mother for the first time, and I fought back an urge to cry. Her expression was so full of life. I could not reconcile that image with the harsh reality I knew. I stayed in the cabin for a few more days. I read the journal entries over and over. She wrote about being excited to welcome a child into the world. She mentioned a name for the baby, but never finished the thought. She described her concern about a wild animal that seemed too intelligent, almost human in its patterns. She wrote that she planned to continue tracking it until she understood its nature. Then her words stopped. I had no information about her fate. My father never told me the circumstances of her death. I felt hollow, betrayed by his secrecy. Eventually, I realized I could no longer wait for him. I packed some belongings in a worn backpack. I took a single firearm, an old revolver with a handful of bullets, and slipped the photograph into my pocket. I had no direction, but felt a need to escape the isolation that had defined my life. I walked away from the cabin under a darkening sky, my bandages tight against my skin. I felt the sting of grief for a mother I never knew. I also felt a small flicker of resentment toward my father. He had withheld so much from me. I had encountered something monstrous in the woods, and I suspected it was connected to everything my mother described. Yet I had no definite answers. I only had my newfound resolve to forge a different path. 9 years slipped by. In that period, I wandered through various rural areas, searching for any sign of my father. I pursued vague rumors and whispered tales of strange beasts, but nothing tangible emerged. I also tried to find Mia, although I had no real information about her location. My efforts led nowhere. Eventually, I discovered a ranch in another southern state that needed a stable hand. The owner offered room and board. I accepted without hesitation. I built a new life there, rising before dawn to feed the horses and clean the stalls. I fixed fences in the blistering sun and learned to ride with caution. I found the work steady, and the ranch owner appreciated my discipline. I rarely spoke about my past. People assumed I was a drifter seeking honest labor. I observed the others who worked on the ranch, but I stayed distant. I did my tasks efficiently. At night, I sometimes wandered beyond the stable, recalling the forest nights of my youth. The difference now was that I had chosen this life, free of my father's harsh oversight. I still experienced vivid nightmares. I saw Mia's face, tears in her eyes, as the monstrous wolf beast threatened her family. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I sensed an unfinished story, as though I had failed to protect her beyond that single encounter. I remembered my father's cryptic words and the strange hints in my mother's journal. The idea of a beast that was neither fully human nor fully animal lingered in my mind. Some nights I found myself scanning the horizon for silhouettes beneath the moon, half expecting that fiend to reappear. Over time, I grew fond of the horses. They were calm but strong animals, and I respected their power. I discovered that quiet grooming sessions helped me settle my own restlessness. I recalled how my father had never allowed me to care for an animal gently. He taught me only to dominate or kill. On the ranch, I learned a softer approach. It gave me fleeting peace. I remained guarded around people, but the ranch hands accepted my reserved manner as part of my personality. A series of unsettling incidents occurred after a few years. Livestock started turning up mutilated in the fields. At first, the owner blamed coyotes, but the sheer brutality of the attacks suggested something larger and more cunning. The torn carcasses showed precise damage. No one on the ranch could explain it. We patrolled with rifles, but we never spotted the culprit. The ranch hands grew anxious. Some refused to go out at night. I recalled the night in the forest when that towering, wolf-like creature attacked. The memory sent a chill through me. I told myself it could not be the same thing. That event had happened too many miles away, in a different place, years earlier. Still, the pattern of these kills triggered an old alarm in my mind. I inspected one of the carcasses more closely. The slashes were clean, almost surgical. It reminded me of the intelligence I had witnessed long ago, a predator that did not behave like a normal animal. One evening, the ranch owner asked me to investigate another part of the property. He wanted me to confirm whether fences were secure. I left on horseback, riding carefully across uneven terrain. As dusk approached, I felt a disquieting sensation. The horse became uneasy, snorting at shadows. I rode back, maintaining a watchful eye on the tree line. But I saw nothing. My thoughts drifted toward that monstrous presence from my past, though I tried to dismiss the possibility. Several nights later, an older ranch hand found a slaughtered horse near a shallow creek. The remains indicated something formidable had done it. Word spread among the ranch workers that we were dealing with a creature far more dangerous than any common predator. Anxiety grew, and some men spoke of werewolves in hushed tones, though most scoffed at the suggestion. I remembered my mother's journal. I remembered the savage intelligence I had witnessed 9 years earlier. One afternoon, I returned from the fields to see a figure standing near the ranch house. He was tall and broad, wearing tattered clothing. As I approached, he turned. His gaze was severe, and I realized it was my father. I froze, unable to speak. He looked older and more scarred. A deep mark ran across his chest, hinting at a vicious wound. He stared at me with anger. I felt my stomach tighten. I returned from the pasture under a dusky sky, leading my horse up a narrow path near the bunkhouse. My senses were on edge from the recent livestock attacks, so I dismounted with caution and looped the reins over a hitching post. That was when I noticed a broad figure standing by the door, motionless in the evening gloom. My breath caught. Even in fading light, I recognized the stance. It was my father, missing for 9 years, now looming as though no time had passed at all. His clothes were shredded, leaving parts of his scarred torso exposed. A vicious mark stretched across his chest, reminiscent of a brutal wound. His eyes gleamed with a hardened malice, and he regarded me as if I were prey. I tried to form a greeting, but confusion and anger knotted my throat. He stared me down for several seconds, silent and tense. Then he spoke, his voice rasping with contempt. He ridiculed me for wasting my potential. He spat that I had grown soft, blending in with these pathetic people on a ranch. It was the first time I had heard his voice in almost a decade, and it was steeped in bitterness. I wanted to ask where he had been, why he left me without a word, but I could only watch as he advanced. I forced out a question. Why now? Why return at this moment? He disregarded it. Instead, he seethed that I had failed him all those years ago, that I had abandoned my true purpose the night I defended a family in the forest. My stomach twisted as I recalled the terrible attack on Mia's campsite. He accused me of letting the real monster slip away, ignoring the single task that mattered. I tried to demand clarity. How could he know any of this? But he cut me off again. His eyes narrowed, and a cruel grin flickered across his face. I realized I had never seen him grin before. The sight unsettled me more than his anger. He said I was a disgrace to everything he had taught. In a flash, the memories of my brutal childhood returned. The relentless training, the days alone in the wilderness, the cold rebukes whenever I showed the slightest hesitation. I felt fury boiling inside me. I wanted him to explain himself, to admit why he had treated me as a mere instrument. He barked a laugh and finally bared the truth. He was the creature that attacked Mia's family. Every horror I had witnessed came from him. He claimed that my mother had died bringing a half-breed abomination, me, into the world. He spoke of a lineage cursed with a beast's strength, connected to a pitiless god that required bloodshed. He said mothers who birthed children of his kind always perished, that his own savage nature had devoured her life the instant I took my first breath. He declared that I carried the seed of the same brutality, though dormant because I had not yet earned the power by fulfilling the tradition. I recoiled at his words, my mind spinning. I thought of my mother's journal, of her last entries about a wolf-like predator too cunning for normal explanation, My father sneered at my horror. He explained the ritual. A son of an elder werewolf must kill his father to claim the full measure of strength. That was why he had driven me to master every weapon, every fighting style. He believed I should have challenged him long ago. The one time I had come close, when he had been gravely wounded by the hatchet, I had chosen instead to protect strangers. That choice, he believed, proved my weakness. He said that he knew I had spent years searching for a certain girl who once offered me kindness. He had followed my actions from afar. Now he possessed her address. He proclaimed he would hunt her down and kill her family during the next full moon, 3 nights away, unless I faced him. I felt my chest constrict, remembering Mia's warm smile and the way she looked at me without fear. I tried to shout at him to stop, but he lashed out with brutal force, striking my jaw and knocking me backward. My head slammed against a wooden cabinet. Dazed, I tasted blood. He called me a coward, cursed me for clinging to human sentiments, and demanded I rise and fight. When I managed to pull myself up, he hurled me against the wall as though I weighed nothing. Darkness crept in at the edges of my vision. Before everything went black, I heard him say that if I failed to arrive for the final confrontation, he would slaughter everyone I had ever cared for. Then there was only silence. I woke on the floor with throbbing pain behind my eyes. My vision took several moments to focus, and when it did, I saw a scrap of paper near my hand. My father's mocking challenge flashed through my mind. I felt nauseated, recalling his declaration that he would slaughter Mia if I refused to face him. My breath came in shallow bursts as I pushed myself upright, wincing at the bruises across my ribs. I snatched up the paper and saw an address inked in jagged handwriting. Mia's full name was there, as well as a street number in a neighboring state. I had not known she lived outside this region. I tasted blood where my father had split my lip. The small bunkhouse around me felt suffocating, its walls closing in. My father's threats hammered at my thoughts. He was the monstrous creature from all those years ago, the beast responsible for attacking innocent campers. He was also the reason my mother never lived to see me grow. The horror of it made my stomach twist. I told myself to focus on what needed to be done. Mia was in danger, and time was short. If I failed to warn her, my father's violence would erupt again. I refused to see more families destroyed. I wrapped my injuries as best I could, gathered whatever money and supplies I had, and set off in my old pickup. The ranch hands were still busy in the fields, unaware of my bruised face. I decided not to speak to them. Explaining anything would have been impossible, and I feared my father might return to kill them if they tried to intervene. The drive took nearly 2 days, crossing back roads and passing through small towns that seemed foreign to me. My body ached with every bump in the road, and my mind churned with doubts. How would Mia react to my sudden reappearance? Would she believe me about an unstoppable werewolf? I imagined her family calling me a madman. Still, I had no choice. At last, I found the street. It was a suburban neighborhood of single-story houses, each with manicured lawns and neat sidewalks. A few children played in front yards, and the hum of cars drifted by. I had never felt more out of place. My father's face haunted me as I parked in front of a small white house. I saw potted plants lining the porch steps. A door chime hung from a bracket. It felt surreal that Mia might be inside, living a simple life with no knowledge of the fate approaching. I walked to the door and knocked, my hand trembling. Footsteps approached. The door opened, and there she stood. Her hair was a little longer, and her features more mature, but I recognized that openness in her eyes. She stared at me, confusion turning to recognition. Her voice wavered as she spoke my name. I tried to reply, but emotion clogged my throat. I had spent years imagining how we might meet again, but not like this. She invited me in, her tone uncertain. Her parents appeared moments later. They saw my injuries, my ragged appearance, and asked who I was. Mia told them I was the stranger who saved their family in the forest years ago, but they seemed wary. I could not blame them. I attempted to explain that they were all in imminent danger, that a murderous beast intended to finish what had started long ago. My words sounded frantic. Mia's father grew alarmed, mentioning the police. I tried to convey that the authorities would be unable to stop what was coming. The more I spoke, the more I realized how unbelievable I sounded. Mia's mother looked at me with concern. Mia herself glanced between me and her parents, torn. She seemed to remember how I had once risked my life to protect them, yet the idea of a supernatural threat was too much. I felt the urgency pounding in my veins, but I could offer no proof. Finally, her parents insisted I leave. They thanked me for whatever help I gave in the past, but told me not to frighten their daughter with outlandish claims. Mia hesitated. I saw a flicker of the old connection between us, but fear and uncertainty weighed on her. She stood by her parents, and I turned away with a heavy heart. I whispered that they should stay vigilant, that danger might arrive soon, but they only watched as I walked back to my truck. The door closed behind me. I drove a few blocks and parked near a wooded lot. My plan was to keep watch from a distance. I felt sure my father would strike under the cover of night when the moon rose. The hours slipped by as I prepared what little weapons I possessed, hoping to shield a family that had already endured one nightmare. I spent the first 2 nights keeping watch from my parked truck, hidden between tall hedges and an abandoned property across the street from Mia's home. I dozed sporadically, waking at each rustle or movement in the neighborhood. My nerves were raw, and my left side still throbbed from the battering my father had given me. I kept a rifle on the passenger seat and several blades stashed near my feet. Each time a car passed, I tensed, but nothing suspicious happened. On the 3rd night, I felt an electric tension in the air as the moon rose higher. Clouds drifted, revealing patches of pale light. I remembered my father's threat. He would come when darkness was thick and hearts were unguarded. I checked my watch repeatedly. Midnight drew close and the suburban streets were quiet. Only distant headlights flickered now and then. No dogs barked. No neighbors stirred. Then I heard a sudden scream muffled by walls. It came from Mia's house. My worst fear slammed into reality. I leaped from the truck, clutching my rifle, and sprinted across the yard. The front door was locked, so I slammed my shoulder into it until the wooden frame cracked. Inside, the lights were dim, and I smelled blood. My lungs seized at the sight in the hallway. Mia's father lay motionless on the floor, his shirt soaked red. Mia's mother cowered in a corner, her eyes wide with horror. Mia stood beside her, trembling. Towering over them was my father, now fully transformed into that monstrous shape I had once seen by firelight. His limbs were elongated, with coarse hair covering his arms. His face was a hideous cross between man and wolf, and his eyes glowed with violent purpose. He glanced at me, baring fangs that dripped with fresh gore. I realized he had already killed Mia's father in a matter of seconds, evading any attempt I had made at surveillance. For an instant, I froze. The creature that sired me had never looked more ruthless. His chest heaved with predatory excitement, as though each kill invigorated him. Mia and her mother were pinned in the corner, nowhere to run. My father fixed his gaze on me, and I knew there was no turning back. He would keep killing until I fought him to the end. I remembered every lesson he had drilled into me. I remembered that savage discipline and the day he left me in a forest with only a knife. This was the final test he had prepared me for my entire life. My mind whirled as I realized he intended for me to accept my monstrous heritage by defeating him. There was no other route. If I fled, he would kill Mia, her mother, my co-workers, anyone connected to me. He was determined to force my hand. I also recalled his words about my mother dying the day I was born, that I was destined to become like him. In that moment, I understood there was no escape from the fate he had imposed since I first drew breath. He emitted a low, rumbling growl, and then lunged for Mia. I saw something unexpected in his eyes, not pure hatred, but a flicker of weariness, as though he, too, longed for an end. That look vanished almost immediately, replaced by a savage intensity. He drove forward, claws outstretched. I bellowed and charged, raising the rifle. I pulled the trigger, but he knocked it aside, sending it clattering across the floor. He slashed at my torso, and hot pain ripped through my flesh. Mia and her mother screamed. I drew a machete from my belt, the blade reflecting the faint hallway light. I swung at his shoulder, feeling the impact vibrate up my arm. He roared in anger, retaliating with a powerful swipe that nearly dislocated my arm. I staggered but refused to yield. We exchanged vicious blows, each of us fueled by desperation and years of honed combat instincts. Blood spattered the walls. Shattered pictures fell from the shelves. Finally, I found an opening. He lunged again, aiming to pin me against the wall. I pivoted and drove the machete into his side with every ounce of strength I possessed. He howled, staggering, but did not collapse. His monstrous form writhed, and he turned to slash me one final time. Summoning a last surge of will, I yanked the machete free and plunged it deep into his chest. His body jerked. He sank to the floor, limbs twitching. I stood there gasping, blood drenching my clothes, uncertain if I was mortally wounded. Mia clung to her mother, sobbing. My father's eyes flickered once, then closed. The house was filled with the stench of gore and terror. I stood in the hallway, the machete slipping from my fingers. My lungs burned, and my ears rang with the echoes of screams. Mia's father lay in a pool of blood. My own father, now still and broken, was sprawled across the floor, his monstrous features fading with each shallow breath. I was too disoriented to fully process what I had done. My side throbbed from deep gashes, and I tasted copper on my tongue. Mia's mother was shaking, tears streaming down her face, while Mia held her with trembling arms. The air felt thick with horror. I realized the entire neighborhood had likely heard the commotion. Sirens in the distance confirmed my suspicion. Police would arrive any minute, and there would be no easy explanation for the scene they would find. A man who looked half wolf, a dead homeowner, and me, drenched in blood, holding a blade. I understood that no one would believe the truth, that this was a centuries-old ritual of werewolves, that my father had forced me to accept a violent legacy. My instincts told me to run, just as he had taught me, escape and vanish before the authorities could pin me down. Still, I hesitated, looking at Mia's tearful face. She was paralyzed by grief and shock. I wanted to comfort her, to say something that might lessen the trauma, but the words would not come. The sirens grew louder. Flashing lights danced across the windows, reflecting on the blood-stained walls. I staggered backward, clutching my injured side. Pain rippled through my chest with every breath. I felt Mia's eyes on me. She called my name, her voice choked, but I could not respond. If I stayed, I would be taken into custody, likely accused of murder. Worse, the authorities would never comprehend the monstrous truth. My father's corpse might revert to a purely human form, sealing my fate as a killer in the eyes of the law. I stumbled through the front door and into the night. Neighbors gathered on lawns, wide-eyed at the spectacle of police cars speeding down the street. A voice shouted to stop, but I could barely focus. My instincts took over. I vaulted a low fence, ignoring the fresh waves of pain. My blood trailed behind me. I heard footsteps and frantic commands from officers, but my training in stealth and evasion guided me. I took advantage of every hedge, every patch of darkness until the clamor faded behind me. Eventually, I reached my battered pickup, parked several blocks away. I flung open the door and collapsed behind the wheel, shaking. My father's final moments repeated in my mind, replaying the savage fight and the glint of sorrow in his eyes. I started the engine, forced the truck onto the road, and drove away, leaving Mia and her mother to deal with the aftermath. It felt like betrayal, but I knew no other path. Daylight found me hiding in a wooded rest area off the highway. My wounds had grown worse, each movement igniting agony. I flicked on the radio, searching for news. An announcer described a grisly homicide in a nearby suburb involving a homeowner and an unidentified intruder. They mentioned a strange, large canine carcass also discovered at the scene. Police were investigating but had released no official statements. No mention of Mia or her mother, only references to disturbing circumstances. I stayed in that wooded spot until late afternoon, tending my injuries with the meager supplies I had. My thoughts circled Mia, wondering if she was safe, if she hated me for bringing this horror into her life again. I questioned if the police would believe her account or if she would bury the truth. The dread of not knowing gnawed at me. By evening, I decided to drive further north, away from heavily populated areas. My father was dead. The monstrous curse he carried now lived in me, whether I wanted it or not. I recalled him saying that the son inherited the true power only after killing the father. I felt a strange ache in my bones, an unsettling warmth beneath my skin, as though something had awakened. I navigated rural back roads, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. My strength was fading. My side was soaked with blood, and my makeshift bandages needed changing. Darkness settled around me, and I pulled into an abandoned barnyard to hide the truck. I limped into the tall grass, slumping near a rotting fence. I felt blood trickle down my arm, my vision dimming. I was alone, with no ally, no family, and an uncertain fate. After a few more ragged breaths, I surrendered to exhaustion and let sleep take me. I wandered for days along remote roads, hiding from passing cars and ignoring the pangs of hunger. My truck eventually ran out of gas on a deserted stretch near thick woodlands. I concealed it beneath branches and made my way on foot, leaning on a scavenged staff for support. My wounds healed faster than expected, as though some hidden vitality stirred within me. Yet the pain was undeniable, and feverish dreams haunted my nights. I saw flashes of my father's face, of him glaring at me with a mixture of hate and weary acceptance. I dreamed of my mother, though I had never truly known her. In those visions, she stood at a forest's edge, silent and sorrowful, as though warning me of something I could not grasp. Each morning I woke disoriented in a nest of leaves or under a makeshift lean-to, my hands shaking from exhaustion. I sensed that the transformation my father spoke of was slowly taking root inside my body. Eventually, I circled back to the state where it all began. Some instinct drew me toward the old cabin where my father had raised me. I trudged through overgrown trails, noticing how the forest had reclaimed much of the terrain. Briars snagged my torn clothes, and silent crows perched on bare branches. The air felt heavier, as though the land remembered the violence that once surrounded this place. The cabin looked smaller than I recalled. A corner of the roof had caved in, letting sunlight spill across the warped floorboards. Dust danced in the beams of light. My footsteps echoed, disturbing an eerie stillness. I scanned the interior, half expecting to find my father's figure lurking in a corner. But of course, he was gone. I checked the rooms, opening drawers and trunks. Most items were exactly as I left them. A few jars of old supplies, scattered pages of notes about firearms and combat drills. My eyes traveled to the spot where I had once discovered my mother's journal. That trunk was empty now, except for a folded cloth. I nearly walked away, but then I noticed a loose board near the hearth. Curiosity drove me to pry it up. Beneath, I found a small metal box, new enough to suggest my father had hidden it recently. My pulse quickened. I unlatched it carefully, expecting perhaps more diaries or weapons. Instead, I found an envelope. I recognized my father's handwriting on the outside. My chest tightened. Even in death, his presence haunted me. I tore open the envelope. A single slip of paper fell into my hand. There, in the same bold scrawl he had used when he wrote that address for Mia, were 4 words. I loved your mother. I stared at those words in stunned silence. Part of me doubted their sincerity. How could he love someone he caused to die? Yet I recalled the flicker of sorrow in his eyes before our final battle, and I felt a bitter pang of understanding. He was a monster, but perhaps some shred of genuine feeling had lived inside him. I sank to the floor, reading those 4 words over and over. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned in me. Grief for the mother I never knew, rage at the father who shaped me into a killer, and a faint pity for the man who wrestled with a curse that consumed everything he touched. I sensed that my father's last act was to leave me this message as a final confession, a tragic acknowledgement of the love he once possessed. I left the cabin holding that scrap of paper. Night approached, the trees casting long shadows. The emptiness weighed on me. I was alone, burdened with a monstrous inheritance I never asked for, mourning a life I might have had if my father had chosen a different path. As dusk fell, I whispered the last words to myself, the only remnant of a doomed love, my love, I love Mia.